I think it's exciting to think about. Now, I tend to concur with you from what you'd mentioned yesterday. This isn't necessarily great for the sport overall in terms of really kind of the balance of power. I mean, you still have, obviously, you have Ohio State from a Big Ten perspective. They're not going anywhere. You have Clemson from an ACC perspective. They're not going anywhere. But when you think of the, like you mentioned, the blue bloods in one conference, such as an Alabama, such as a Georgia, and you bring Oklahoma and Texas in there, and you have Florida. You have clearly, I mean, not even close, the best conference in the country. So now, where do the dominoes fall? Kind of, if you will. So I think first it's important to talk about the Big 12. Obviously, what do they do? I think there's varying opinions out there. Do they almost immediately fold? Do they try to scramble? I think first and foremost, I would anticipate them scrambling a little bit just to see what the interest looks like from some other schools. We talked about this yesterday as well. I think you make a call. Tony brought this up. I completely forgot this team. You probably make a call to SMU. You have that Dallas area, which would be good, beneficial for the Big 12 certainly. You probably make a call to Cincinnati. You make a call to Houston. You make a call to UCF. Just to kind of gauge the intrigue, the interest from those schools, and then see what that looks like. Because all signs had pointed to the rest of the 8 members as of yesterday being committed to making it work within the Big 8 plus whatever they're able to do. Now, I think that a lot of the schools are looking at some contingencies. There was a report that came out this morning that Kansas has already approached the Big Ten just to see what kind of interest they would have. Certainly, you would expect similar, probably some similar things, maybe from an Oklahoma State related to the Pac-12, related to maybe an Iowa State in the Big Ten, maybe related to a West Virginia in the ACC type of thing. But yeah, I think so. I would say that's the first step. I think if it looks like that, maybe you see some of those American Athletic Conference teams, not interested, whether it's whatever that looks like, then I think you get to more of a contingency side of it, and where you look at some of these schools in the Big 12 really look more towards, okay, where can we best position ourselves to be successful, overall. And then you also look at it from another conference perspective, the Big Ten specifically. The Big Ten would just be adding a Kansas and an Iowa State just to have them. I mean, it's not really any doesn't certainly from a football perspective, especially Kansas, it doesn't give them any added benefit. Iowa State is more of a is a with Matt Campbell is more of a rising star type of team in the landscape of college football, but it does a lot for basketball, certainly with Iowa State and Kansas there, but doesn't certainly do a whole lot for football as your main revenue generating sport. So I think it's going to be very intriguing to see where the dominoes fall and how they fall over something that's going to happen, fairly quickly. I think where we were at is kind of crazy to think about where we were at yesterday when we were talking about this, and then understand where we're at today. Where we kind of left yesterday was, the Big 12 was arranging a conference call with the athletic directors and the CEOs. All 10 members of the conference, as it states right now, were invited. Oklahoma and Texas decided not to be part of that conversation. So really, the tone of the conversation was, what do we do to keep the Big 12 alive? What's the contingency look like? And frankly, I think some anger towards Oklahoma and Texas related to some of the decisions that they were looking at and making. So I think you saw a little bit of the writing on the wall there, and then you've seen some reports this morning that says as soon as 24 to 48 hours, Oklahoma and Texas plan on letting the Big 12 know that they don't plan on moving forward with with the Big 12 at this time, certainly past the 2025 rights thing. Certainly, we'll talk about that. Don't expect that to even happen. They're going to show a united front, I believe, and I think they're going to show a clear support for Oklahoma and Texas, coming into this. And when you look at from an Oklahoma and Texas perspective, we've dissected this so many times, taken it back and really looked at it. There's not a lot of negative, honestly, for either school financially. We know it's going to be a huge hit with the, specifically when you talk about a TV contract perspective, millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually, that's been poured into this new ESPN deal with SEC over the last last year, I guess I should say, with. And then, when you look at on the field, you would have to believe that recruiting you would get a benefit from recruiting. Oklahoma's done a lot better, here as of late last few years in recruiting, but you only think that would get better for both schools. I think the one thing that would caution, and I've seen a lot of this through social media over the last couple of days, but the one thing I would, if you're an Oklahoma fan, certainly don't expect Oklahoma to come in here and start dominating the SEC at the same level that they have the Big 12. I think something interesting that I was watching earlier today, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, that over the last decade, when has there been a game where Oklahoma has lined up against an opposition in the Big 12 conference when Oklahoma was at a roster disadvantage from a talent perspective? I mean, maybe once or twice. Maybe a Texas team had some better, more talented kids. Now, the first year in the SEC, you're probably going to go up, even if, let's just say, Oklahoma was in the SEC right now competing this fall. Certainly don't know what the schedules would look like. You would think at a minimum, maybe 2 or 3 games, at a minimum, you would probably be at a roster disadvantage in terms of pure talent on the field. So I think the notion that Oklahoma's going to go in there and dominate is not quite accurate. But I think also the notion that Oklahoma is going to be 6th, 7th in the Big 12 isn't accurate either, right? So, when the conference alignment, it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. But, if you were to take what we were talking about yesterday in terms of, you have Oklahoma and you have Texas A&M, you have Missouri, you have Arkansas, you have Mississippi and Mississippi State, and LSU. Oklahoma's probably the leader in terms of from a prediction perspective on who would win that division. Certainly Oklahoma and LSU and A&M are right there with one another. So I think it's going to be incredible to see how this changes. And then there's obviously the playoff expansion is a big part of it. The NIL is a big part of it. There's so many parts of the changing landscape of collegiate athletics that are part of this overarching decision.
So in terms of Oklahoma and Texas competing in the SEC, I think this is pretty reasonable. First off, everything that you just said, I can agree with that. There's one thing to match up the teams in a one-game scenario in which you can look at the last 7 or 8 years and how has Oklahoma fared. They've fared generally well against the SEC, but of course they have not fared well in the 2 matchups at the very top level when they were facing a national championship caliber team. Alabama drilled them in the first half. What was it, 28-0? It got closer. It looked better at the end. LSU drilled them. But we're talking about, to be fair, those are the teams that you need to beat to win a championship. But also, to be fair, we're talking about the best team in the sport that particular year that they were facing. Also, we need to consider that. So Jason brings forth the talent. And I think that comment very much speaks to a situation in which maybe Oklahoma lines up against an LSU. And if you really want to grind through the recruiting rankings on the roster, and even though Oklahoma's been at that level for the last 1 or 2 recruiting cycles, if you look at the entire roster, actually LSU would technically have more talent. That doesn't mean they're a better team, That
Sure.
means that they have more measurable talent on the roster. And again, I think most people would agree Oklahoma is a better football team right now, because of the quarterback position, because of developing the players, and because of the system in place. But just if you're talking about trying to handle a team that can run fast and jump high and do all those things on a given day, it can be very difficult. You can suddenly have an 8-4 SEC team be very difficult to handle if they're hot that day. And then it's kind of the accumulation of the games as well. It's instead of facing a TCU that's a really good team here and then having a couple weeks where you're facing decent competition and then you got to get ready Oklahoma State, more of that gauntlet that you see more so in the SEC Western Division that can weigh on a team that even if you match up Oklahoma against them individually, they are better. When it's Texas A&M, then it's Auburn the next week, then it's Ole Miss the next week, then it's LSU the next week, that the chances of getting upset increase considerably.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think, yeah. So for people to come in there and say that Oklahoma's not going to take some lumps early on, I think that's fair to say. I mean, they're certainly going to take some of those lumps. Now, it's not going to be a considerable. Oklahoma's not going to go to a a 6-6 or a 7-5 team, immediately. But I think Oklahoma has been, over the last 10 years, Oklahoma has been the favorite, certainly to win the Big 12 year after year. And I think it's certainly a disappointment, especially winning 6 straight. I think it's a disappointment for Oklahoma fans if Oklahoma did not win the Big 12 conference, especially this year. Having said that, I think those expectations change. I mean, I think rightfully so at the top. And I think a good, kind of expectation and a good, maybe a goal. Certainly, Oklahoma wouldn't do this internally, but just us as watching it from the outside in, for Oklahoma to win the conference, maybe one every 4 or 5 years overall, the conference. And so the one thing I would say about Oklahoma heading into this, I think they're better positioned to make this move now than they were maybe 10 years ago in terms of how much better they're recruiting, the talent level on defense that they've been able to get to. If they're in the SEC, 5 years ago, I mean, they might be throwing out a 7-5, 6-6 season, or maybe even worse with the horrible defensive play that they have played. So I think that's all part of the consideration as well. When you think about this move, and one thing that you mentioned, Mark, that I wanted to kind of hit on is something that I've heard a lot about over the last few years. Is not really the interest is dying down in terms of attending home football games at the University of Oklahoma, but I think the home experience has kind of outweighed that. We've seen, specifically into the pandemic year, I mean, that's a little bit different certainly, but we've seen Oklahoma's home schedule not be as strong, so a lot of people opted out on season tickets, choosing to watch things at home perhaps. And then that's kind of continued a little bit into this year, more so than a lot of people anticipated. And I think a part of that's because of the schedule. So when you think about reinvigorating some excitement into the program, when you look at the possibility of of an Oklahoma facing an LSU, a Texas A&M, every year, certainly half of those games will be at home. And then the schedule is much tougher, but I think it's much more enjoyable for the fan. For a majority of the fans, you would likely see those people that are opting out on season tickets. They're gonna be standing in line to get back in to go see Oklahoma host an Alabama, a Georgia, a Tennessee, a Florida, an LSU, whoever that might be. So I think that's part of it as well. So there's so many contributing factors. I think when you kind of take a look back at this and see how this happened, I think Oklahoma's a little upset with the 11 a.m. kickoffs being what they are. It is kind of is what it is with the current TV contract. But be that as may, they're still, I think, they've been a little upset with that getting their more of their fair share. And I think part of it was this year with the Nebraska kickoff. The 50th anniversary of the 71 game of the century. I think that took a lot of people, a little bit by surprise and just kind of put more fuel to the fire. And I think it's gone from there. But I think that's one thing to think about in terms of the competition on the field and just the enjoyment for the fan interaction to be even better. Thinking about what the rivalries might look like. And there was somebody, one of the podcasts I was watching a little bit earlier this morning was talking about how exciting would it be, Thanksgiving weekend, Oklahoma and LSU prime time on at Tiger Stadium, for the SEC West, at that point, whatever that looks like. So I think right now there's so much excitement about the what ifs that are going with this, and still, having said that, it's still very, at least to me, very surreal that something this huge is really kind of taking place right now.